What if the real power behind New York City was not sitting in City Hall, not standing on Wall Street, and not wearing a police badge, but instead gathering quietly in back rooms, social clubs, and dimly lit restaurants, shaping the destiny of America's largest city from the shadows? For decades, 5 powerful crime families operated with a level of structure, discipline, and influence that rivaled legitimate corporations and political institutions, creating an underground system of governance that affected construction projects, labor unions, waste management routes, gambling operations, and even the pace at which skyscrapers rose into the Manhattan skyline. The story of New York's 5 mafia families is not just a tale of crime. It is a story about organization, power, ambition, and control, and about how a network of criminal syndicates managed to build a parallel authority inside one of the most important cities in the world. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the early 20th century, when waves of immigrants arrived in New York seeking opportunity but often found overcrowded tenements, limited job prospects, and social discrimination instead. In neighborhoods like Little Italy in Manhattan and sections of Brooklyn and the Bronx, tightly knit communities formed around shared language and heritage, and within those communities, certain groups began offering protection, employment, and connections that operated outside official law. Over time, small street gangs evolved into more organized criminal enterprises, and rival factions battled for dominance in what became known as the Castellamarese War, a violent power struggle that reshaped the structure of organized crime in the city. Out of that chaos emerged a new vision for organized crime, championed by figures who believed that endless bloodshed was bad for business. The result was a more centralized, corporate-style model that divided New York into territories controlled by 5 separate but cooperative families, each with its own leadership but bound together by shared rules and a governing commission designed to prevent internal wars. These 5 families, later known as the Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese families, would come to define organized crime in America for generations. What made these families so effective was not just intimidation or violence, but structure. Each family operated with a clear hierarchy that resembled a military chain of command. At the top sat the boss, the ultimate authority whose word carried absolute weight within the organization. Beneath him was the underboss, responsible for managing day-to-day operations and ensuring orders were executed efficiently. Serving as an advisor was the consigliere, a trusted counselor who offered strategic guidance and mediated disputes. Below this upper administration were capo regimes, commonly called capos, who commanded crews of soldiers. These soldiers were officially inducted members who carried out the family's operations on the ground, from collecting payments to overseeing illegal enterprises. Associates, who were not formally initiated but worked closely with the family, handled many of the lower-level tasks and often aspired to full membership. This structure created stability, accountability, and discipline. Orders flowed downward, money flowed upward, and loyalty was enforced through a strict code of silence known as Omertà. Breaking that code could mean exile or death. By dividing responsibilities and territories, the 5 families reduced internal conflict and maximized profits. Each family controlled specific neighborhoods and industries, and disputes were settled through negotiation or through the commission, which functioned almost like a board of directors for organized crime. This system allowed them to operate with remarkable longevity. Their influence extended far beyond traditional street crimes like extortion or loan sharking. One of their most lucrative strategies was infiltration of legitimate industries. Construction became a gold mine. By controlling labor unions and threatening strikes or slowdowns, the families could pressure contractors into paying for labor peace. Major infrastructure projects, from bridges to office towers, often required negotiations not only with city officials, but with underworld representatives who demanded a cut in exchange for ensuring smooth operations. Waste management was another key sector. By controlling private sanitation routes, certain families created monopolies, eliminating competition through intimidation and forcing businesses to pay inflated fees. Illegal gambling operations flourished as well, including numbers rackets, sports betting, and later more sophisticated schemes tied to casinos and offshore accounts. These operations generated enormous cash flow, much of it untraceable, allowing the families to reinvest in new ventures and maintain loyalty among members through steady earnings. Their reach also extended into labor unions. By placing loyal figures in leadership positions within powerful unions, they could influence contract negotiations, control hiring decisions, and extract kickbacks from employers. In some cases, this meant that billions of dollars in economic activity were indirectly shaped by organized crime. The public facade often remained clean. Many bosses presented themselves as businessmen or community figures, attending weddings, charity events, and religious ceremonies, while their organizations operated behind the scenes. The contrast between their public image and their private operations added to their mystique and their power. Fear played a significant role, but so did reputation. A business owner who understood the consequences of refusal often chose cooperation without open threats ever being spoken. The effectiveness of the five families lay in this blend of intimidation, organization, and strategic patience. They avoided unnecessary publicity and preferred steady income over reckless violence. Yet violence remained an ever-present tool, used selectively to enforce discipline or eliminate rivals. Assassinations were calculated, not random. The message was clear. The organization was permanent, and disobedience would not be tolerated. Over time, certain families rose to particular prominence. The Gambino family, for example, became synonymous with power in the latter half of the 20th century, especially during the era of high-profile leadership that drew intense media attention. The Genovese family developed a reputation for being especially secretive and cautious, often avoiding the spotlight while maintaining strong internal control. The Lucchese and Bonanno families cultivated their own spheres of influence, while the Colombo family experienced periods of internal conflict that sometimes spilled into public view. Despite differences in style and leadership, all five families adhered to the same fundamental blueprint established during the reorganization of the 1930s. That blueprint emphasized unity among the families, a structured chain of command, and a focus on profit over chaos. Their influence shaped neighborhoods in subtle ways. Certain construction projects moved forward only after agreements were reached. Certain businesses thrived because they had the right connections. Even cultural perceptions of New York were influenced by the presence of organized crime, which became embedded in books, films, and television, reinforcing both fascination and fear. Yet behind the cinematic portrayals was a complex reality of economic manipulation, political corruption, and calculated strategy. Law enforcement agencies at first struggled to address the scope of this network. Traditional prosecutions targeted individual crimes, but the families operated as interconnected organizations. Removing one soldier did little to disrupt the larger structure. The hierarchical model ensured continuity. If a capo was arrested, another stepped in. If a boss was imprisoned, an acting boss maintained operations. This resilience frustrated investigators for decades. Meanwhile, the families adapted to changing times. As technology advanced, so did their methods. They diversified into new forms of fraud, expanded gambling operations, and sought opportunities wherever regulation created vulnerability. They understood that control over information was as important as control over territory. Meetings were discreet, conversations were guarded. Trust was limited to those who had proven loyalty over years, sometimes decades. The initiation ceremony itself symbolized the seriousness of commitment, binding members to the organization with rituals meant to emphasize permanence and sacrifice. By mid-century, the five families had become deeply embedded in the fabric of New York City. Their operations touched everything from small neighborhood businesses to major infrastructure developments. They influenced hiring practices, resolved disputes through intimidation rather than courts, and maintained a shadow system of governance that operated parallel to official authority. For many residents, their presence was simply part of the city's reality, an unspoken understanding that certain doors opened only with the right connections and certain problems were solved through unofficial channels. The scale of their influence raised profound questions about power and legitimacy. How could organizations built on illegal foundations exert such sustained control in a modern democracy? The answer lay partly in organization and partly in opportunity. Economic hardship, political corruption, and gaps in enforcement created openings that disciplined criminal enterprises were quick to exploit. By presenting themselves as providers of order in chaotic environments, they gained footholds that proved difficult to dislodge. Their story is not just about criminal acts, but about systems, about how structure, loyalty, and strategic thinking allowed 5 families to shape the destiny of a city that prided itself on resilience and ambition. And as their empire expanded, so too did the challenge facing those determined to dismantle it, setting the stage for a confrontation between organized crime and federal authority that would redefine both. As the 5 families tightened their grip on New York, their strength did not rely solely on fear or reputation, but on an intricate internal system that transformed criminal activity into a disciplined enterprise resembling a multinational corporation. At the heart of each family was a clearly defined chain of command designed to ensure efficiency, loyalty, and continuity. The boss stood at the pinnacle, insulated from direct involvement in street-level operations and shielded by layers of trusted intermediaries. His authority was both symbolic and absolute, reinforced by ritual, tradition, and the understanding that his decisions affected the survival of the entire organization. Beneath him, the underboss functioned as the operational commander, translating strategy into action and supervising the capos who managed individual crews. The consigliere, often underestimated by outsiders, served as a stabilizing force, advising the boss, resolving internal conflicts, and preventing impulsive decisions that could trigger unnecessary wars. This triangular leadership model created balance, preventing power from concentrating recklessly in one impulsive individual while preserving unity. Below the administration were the capo regimes, each responsible for a crew of soldiers and associates who generated income through a range of ventures. These crews operated almost like franchises, each with its own rackets, but obligated to pass a portion of profits up the hierarchy. Money flowed upward in a steady stream, creating a financial pipeline that funded legal defenses, supported imprisoned members' families, and reinforced loyalty through tangible rewards. The soldiers, formally inducted through solemn ceremonies, were bound by Omertà, the code of silence that demanded absolute secrecy. Breaking this code was considered the ultimate betrayal, not just of individuals, but of an entire lineage. Associates, who often outnumbered made members, formed the outer layer of the organization. They carried out tasks, ran businesses, and proved their worth in hopes of eventual induction. This layered system allowed the families to distance leadership from direct criminal acts, making prosecution difficult and ensuring that operations continued even when lower-level participants were arrested. The organizational genius of the 5 families lay in this compartmentalization. Information was shared strictly on a need-to-know basis. A soldier might know his immediate superior and his crew's activities, but not the broader strategy. Capos reported earnings and issues upward, but rarely questioned directives. The commission, composed of the heads of the families, functioned as a governing council that resolved disputes and approved major decisions, including assassinations of high-ranking members. By institutionalizing conflict resolution, they minimized destructive infighting that had plagued earlier eras. This structure created stability that lasted decades. Their infiltration of legitimate industries became increasingly sophisticated. Construction remained one of the most lucrative sectors. By controlling key unions and threatening work stoppages, they could demand payments from developers who preferred predictable costs over unpredictable delays. Large-scale projects in Manhattan and beyond often involved quiet negotiations to secure labor peace. The cost of doing business sometimes included hidden surcharges funneled through shell companies and inflated contracts. Waste hauling provided another steady stream of revenue. Through intimidation and strategic alliances, certain families established control over commercial sanitation routes, effectively creating cartels that eliminated competition. Businesses that attempted to switch providers often faced subtle threats or sudden disruptions. Over time, this control allowed organized crime to influence pricing and secure consistent cash flow. Gambling operations evolved as well. The traditional numbers racket, deeply embedded in working-class neighborhoods, generated reliable daily income. Later, sports betting networks expanded, connecting local bookmakers to larger systems that managed risk across multiple states. Even as laws shifted and some forms of gambling became legal, the families adapted, exploiting regulatory loopholes and leveraging relationships to maintain relevance. Loan sharking provided quick profits through high-interest loans extended to individuals and small businesses unable to secure traditional financing. Debts were enforced with a mix of intimidation and calculated leniency, ensuring repayment while avoiding unnecessary law enforcement attention. Beyond these visible rackets, white-collar crimes grew in importance. Fraud schemes, bid rigging, and stock manipulation allowed members to tap into expanding financial markets. The line between legitimate business and organized crime blurred. Front companies operated openly, employing people who may not have realized the deeper connections behind their employers. This blending of legal and illegal enterprises complicated investigations, as tracing funds required unraveling layers of corporate filings and shell entities. Political connections further strengthened their position. Contributions, favors, and quiet endorsements created relationships that shielded certain operations from scrutiny. While not every official was compromised, enough were influenced to create obstacles for reform. The families understood that influence often mattered more than brute force. A well-placed ally in a regulatory office could prevent audits or delay investigations, buying valuable time. Meanwhile, cultural perceptions of the Mafia evolved. Films and books romanticized aspects of their lifestyle, portraying codes of honor and family loyalty that obscured the brutality underlying their operations. This cultural fascination sometimes created a paradoxical aura of legitimacy, reinforcing myths that masked economic exploitation. Yet beneath the mythology was a rigid enforcement mechanism. Internal discipline was uncompromising. Members who stole from the family, cooperated with authorities, or defied orders faced severe consequences. Violence, though less frequent than during earlier power struggles, remained a decisive tool. It was used strategically to send messages and maintain order. Public displays were avoided when possible, as excessive visibility invited federal attention. Over time, however, law enforcement began adapting. Investigators recognized that targeting isolated crimes was ineffective against such structured organizations. Surveillance techniques improved, and wiretaps provided glimpses into conversations that had long been hidden. Informants, once rare due to the power of Omertà, began to emerge, motivated by lengthy prison sentences and changing cultural attitudes. These insiders offered unprecedented insight into hierarchy and operations, confirming what authorities had long suspected about the corporate-like structure of the families. The introduction of more aggressive prosecution strategies marked a turning point. Instead of focusing solely on individual acts, prosecutors sought to demonstrate patterns of racketeering that connected leadership to street-level crimes. This approach required patience and extensive evidence, but promised more substantial results. The very hierarchy that had protected bosses now became a framework prosecutors could map and present to juries. By showing how orders flowed downward and profits moved upward, they could argue that leaders were responsible for the actions of their subordinates. The families responded with caution, reducing overt meetings and adopting coded language. Some leaders embraced a low-profile strategy, avoiding media attention and delegating public-facing roles to others. Despite these adjustments, the pressure mounted. High-profile trials exposed internal secrets, eroding the aura of invincibility. Sentences grew longer, and the cost of loyalty increased as more members faced decades behind bars. Still, the resilience of the structure was remarkable. Acting bosses stepped in when leaders were imprisoned. Capos reorganized crews. Revenue streams shifted but did not vanish. The five families had survived wars, economic downturns, and internal betrayals. They were not easily dismantled. Their adaptability was rooted in a fundamental principle: prioritize continuity over ego. Leaders who drew too much attention risked destabilizing the entire organization. Those who governed quietly often maintained influence longer. As New York evolved through economic booms and crises, the families adjusted accordingly. During times of urban decline, they capitalized on weakened oversight. During revitalization, they sought opportunities in new developments. Their presence became less visible, but not entirely absent. Federal authorities intensified their efforts, refining strategies and coordinating across agencies. Cooperation between local police, federal prosecutors, and specialized task forces improved information sharing. Complex cases were built over years, relying on financial records, surveillance, and insider testimony. The balance of power slowly shifted. The passage of comprehensive anti-racketeering legislation empowered prosecutors to charge entire criminal enterprises rather than isolated participants. This legal innovation recognized that organized crime functioned as a system, not a collection of random offenses. By targeting the system itself, authorities struck at the core of the five families' strength. Trials became platforms for exposing decades of operations, revealing the methods used to infiltrate industries and maintain control. Public perception shifted as the reality of exploitation and coercion overshadowed romanticized portrayals. Communities once resigned to underworld influence began to see tangible consequences for those who had long operated with impunity. The transformation was gradual, not sudden. Some families experienced internal fractures as trust eroded and informants increased. Others attempted to modernize, reducing traditional rackets in favor of less conspicuous schemes. Yet the era of unchecked dominance was fading. The very organization that had once provided resilience now created paper trails and testimony chains that could be pieced together in courtrooms. The commission system, once a symbol of unity, became evidence of coordinated enterprise. By the late 20th century, the confrontation between federal authority and the five families had reshaped both sides. Law enforcement had developed tools specifically designed to dismantle hierarchical crime networks, while organized crime struggled to maintain cohesion under sustained pressure. The balance that had once favored secrecy and structure began tilting toward transparency and accountability. And although the families did not disappear entirely, their ability to shape the city with the same confidence and reach was permanently altered, signaling the beginning of a new chapter in the complex relationship between power, crime, and the evolution of New York itself. And as their empire expanded, so too did the challenge facing those determined to dismantle it, setting the stage for a confrontation between organized crime and federal authority that would redefine both. By the time federal prosecutors fully embraced the power of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the long-standing dominance of New York's five families was facing its most serious threat since their creation in the 1930s. And what made this moment historic was not simply the arrest of individual mobsters, but the recognition that organized crime functioned as an interconnected enterprise that could be prosecuted as a whole. For decades, law enforcement had chipped away at soldiers and low-level operators, only to watch replacements step into their roles with seamless efficiency. But RICO changed the battlefield by allowing prosecutors to connect leadership to patterns of criminal activity carried out by subordinates, demonstrating that bosses who rarely touched illegal transactions were still responsible for orchestrating them. This shift transformed courtrooms into arenas where the very structure that had once protected the families was carefully mapped out in charts, testimonies, and financial records, exposing hierarchies that had operated in shadows for generations. High-profile trials revealed how orders flowed from bosses to underbosses, from capos to soldiers, and how profits from construction kickbacks, labor union manipulation, gambling networks, and loan sharking were systematically funneled upward. Jurors who once might have struggled to see beyond isolated charges were now presented with a comprehensive picture of enterprise-level criminal governance. The symbolism of these prosecutions was powerful, signaling that even the most insulated leaders could no longer rely on layers of loyalty to shield them indefinitely. Informants played a critical role in this transformation. As sentences grew longer and prison conditions harsher, the calculus of silence began to change. Members who had once sworn lifelong allegiance faced the reality of spending decades behind bars, while leaders continued operating outside. Some chose cooperation, providing investigators with detailed accounts of initiation ceremonies, revenue-sharing arrangements, and internal disciplinary actions. These testimonies shattered the myth of impenetrable Omertà and offered prosecutors insider perspectives that strengthened complex cases. The exposure of the commission, the governing body that coordinated major decisions among the families, further illustrated the organized nature of their operations. By presenting evidence that demonstrated collective oversight of rackets and disputes, Federal authorities reinforced the argument that the five families functioned as a coordinated system rather than independent gangs. Convictions under RICO carried severe penalties, often resulting in lengthy prison terms that removed entire tiers of leadership at once. When bosses and underbosses were sentenced simultaneously, the vacuum of authority disrupted carefully balanced chains of command. Acting leaders stepped in, but the constant threat of surveillance and prosecution created an atmosphere of uncertainty that weakened long-term planning. Financial strain followed. Legal defenses for multiple high-ranking members drained resources, and increased scrutiny made traditional rackets riskier. Construction firms and union officials, once intimidated into compliance, began distancing themselves from underworld connections as federal oversight intensified. Waste management monopolies faced regulatory reforms that encouraged competition and transparency. Gambling operations encountered shifting legal landscapes as states expanded regulated gaming options, reducing the profitability of illegal alternatives. The families adapted, attempting to diversify into less visible forms of fraud, including identity theft, healthcare scams, and cyber-related schemes. But the scale and cohesion of earlier decades proved difficult to replicate under constant investigation. Media coverage amplified the impact of these changes. Televised trials and detailed reporting transformed once mysterious figures into public defendants, stripping away the aura of untouchability that had fueled their legend. Communities that had long perceived organized crime as an unavoidable element of city life began witnessing tangible accountability. Cultural portrayals continued to romanticize aspects of Mafia history, but real-world consequences became harder to ignore. The narrative shifted from invincible syndicates to aging institutions struggling to maintain relevance in a rapidly evolving urban environment. Demographic changes also influenced the landscape. Neighborhoods that once served as tight-knit enclaves supporting underworld recruitment diversified economically and culturally, altering social networks that had sustained loyalty across generations. Younger individuals found alternative opportunities in legitimate industries, reducing the appeal of criminal affiliation that carried increasing legal risk. Technology further eroded traditional methods of secrecy. Surveillance cameras, digital financial records, and electronic communication created trails that were far more difficult to conceal than cash transactions and face-to-face meetings. While encrypted devices and coded language offered temporary shields, law enforcement agencies developed specialized units capable of navigating these new terrains. Collaboration between federal, state, and local authorities improved, creating coordinated strategies that mirrored, in some ways, the very structure once used by the families to govern themselves. The result was a prolonged decline rather than a dramatic collapse. The five families did not vanish overnight, nor did organized crime disappear from New York, but the era in which they could shape billion-dollar industries with relative impunity came to an end. Leadership transitions became more cautious, with figures deliberately avoiding flamboyant displays of wealth or public attention. Meetings grew smaller, profits slimmer, and ambitions more restrained. The Commission's influence waned as interfamily coordination became riskier under surveillance. Some factions experienced internal distrust, fueled by fears of informants, fracturing unity that had once been their greatest strength. Yet even in decline, remnants of the old structure persisted. Small crews continued operating localized schemes, drawing on traditions passed down through decades. The legacy of hierarchy, ritual, and coded loyalty remained embedded in certain circles, a testament to the durability of the model established during the reorganization that ended the Castellammarise War. Historians and criminologists analyzing this period often point to the RICO era as a watershed moment in American law enforcement, demonstrating how legal innovation can reshape entrenched systems of power. By targeting enterprise-level conduct, authorities acknowledged that crime at this scale required systemic solutions. The success of these prosecutions influenced strategies against other forms of organized crime, from drug cartels to corporate fraud rings, reinforcing the principle that structure itself can be evidence. For New York City, the weakening of the five families marked a broader transformation. Economic revitalization projects moved forward with reduced underworld interference. Labor unions underwent reforms aimed at restoring autonomy and transparency. Waste management and construction sectors adapted to competitive markets less constrained by coercion. While corruption did not disappear entirely, the scale of centralized criminal governance diminished significantly. The city's identity evolved alongside these changes, embracing new industries and cultural shifts that distanced it from the shadow-dominated narrative of earlier decades. Reflecting on the arc of the five families reveals a complex interplay between opportunity, organization, and accountability. Their rise was fueled by social conditions, economic gaps, and strategic vision that transformed scattered gangs into a coordinated syndicate capable of influencing one of the world's most important cities. Their endurance was sustained by disciplined hierarchy, loyalty reinforced through ritual, and calculated use of violence balanced with restraint. Their decline emerged not from a single dramatic confrontation, but from persistent, methodical legal pressure combined with societal evolution that reduced their leverage. The story underscores how systems built on secrecy and coercion can achieve remarkable longevity, yet remain vulnerable to structural countermeasures that expose and dismantle them. It also illustrates the adaptability of both criminal enterprises and the institutions tasked with combating them. Each adjusted tactics in response to the other, creating a decades-long chess match played across courtrooms, construction sites, union halls, and quiet backrooms. In the end, the transformation reshaped more than the underworld. It influenced legal doctrine, investigative methodology, and public perception of power itself. The five families left an indelible imprint on New York's history, shaping neighborhoods, industries, and cultural narratives in ways that continue to resonate. Their story serves as a reminder that influence can grow strongest where oversight is weakest, and that even the most entrenched networks can be challenged when innovation meets persistence. The city they once dominated has moved into a different era, but understanding how these syndicates rose, structured themselves, and were ultimately confronted provides insight into the dynamics of organized power everywhere. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.